For beings with awareness of time and of the present as opposed to the future and the past, every moment seems to carry an element of nothingness within itself. Every instant is irretrievably gone before we know it. Time in this sense, Sartre observes, separates me from myself, from what I have been, from what I wish to be, from what I wish to do, from things and from others. When understood as the steady transformation of potential future into actual past by reference to a dynamic human perspective, fixated on the present, time brings everything to an end in every single moment. It may seem to dissolve the world into an infinite dust of instants.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. But if not, if you could perhaps leave us a review on iTunes, either way, we'd certainly appreciate it. But today, Taylor and I are very pleased to bring our guest, Espen Hammer. Espen's main interests include Kant, German idealism, social and political philosophy, modern European philosophy, and phenomenology. Some of the works he has completed are Adorno's Modernism, Art, Experience, and Catastrophe, Adorno and the Political, Thinking the Political, and of course today's topic of discussion, Philosophy and Temporality from Kant to Critical Theory. So Espen, thank you so much for joining us. And I have to say, what an amazing name. It's almost as cool as Cooper Cherry. No, actually, I think it's better, to be quite honest. Anyhow,
you don't know my
welcome
father's
to...
name. You don't know my dad's name.
What's your dad's
name?
It is, in fact, Thor Hammer.
Oh my.
Incredible.
Actually,
my dad's name is also Cooper, so.
Well, Thor Hammer, I feel like that's just almost too good.
Right?
It's powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Philosophizing with a hammer.
Well, no, of course, yes. Philosophizing with a hammer is. I'm sure Espen, you've heard that one before or thought about that one.
That's
right?
my motto.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Espen, I know you've edited a number of works too. Some of them you reference in the book, particularly on German idealism. And I guess I was curious about, before we ask you about your origin story, because we do like to ask our guests about sort of how they got into philosophy and all of that. Before you do that, and I'll give you a second to think about maybe something interesting you can tell our audience about just what it was for you that got you into philosophy. I just wanted to know, on a technical level, what goes into editing volumes? Do you go to a press and kind of say, I have this idea, or are you contacted and sort of told to be in charge of this, or is it kind of something in between that?
I think both. I mean, sometimes you get in touch with publishers, editors, and you have a conversation with them, and people start tossing up ideas.
Right.
And you realize this might be a project worth undertaking. That was the case with the volume on idealism from 2005. Mm-hmm. I also co-edited a couple of volumes on critical theory, on the Frankfurt School, and on Adorno. And they were also the result of a certain while of conversations with editors who became interested. It's a little hard for me to say exactly which side initiated the idea first,
right,
with conversations. But I find editing volumes to be, I mean, it can be a lot of work, but it's also, I find it an incredibly interesting and rewarding type of activity. Like, you really get to work with other philosophers very closely over a long time, and it's stimulating, I find,
I
intellectually.
mean, you can imagine it's kind of like an extension of a conference type format. If you think about it, it's taking that further, formalizing it, and also putting it in a format that can take it outside of that spatiotemporal instantaneity and allow others to participate and learn from what may not be further disseminated. So I think that it's a really undervalued, or at least maybe perhaps underappreciated aspect of various whatever discipline is under consideration. Editing these volumes, as you said, it may take a little bit of work. You may not get a lot of love for it, but and I think in that sense, it reminds me a little bit of translation too, right? It may be, you may not get all the praise and whatnot, but you still help to bring these thoughts to a wider audience that may not otherwise be able to participate and join that chorus of scholarly voices.
Absolutely. And obviously, as you know, many of these volumes have an origin going back to a conference, and people start thinking, hey, these are actually really good papers. Why don't we see whether we can turn this into a volume and have people revisit their presentations and, build them up to complete articles that can be published in the volume. And sometimes that can function very well.
That's exactly right. And 2 questions, and we can tackle them one after the other. But I mentioned we do want to hear about, we love hearing from our guests just what inspired them to, as I kind of say, get into philosophy. There could be a serendipitous moment, some kind of fortuitous encounter. There could be a first sort of exposure that in your memory, what kind of solidifies when you think back the sort of idea or desire for or love for philosophy, literature, academic work? Do you have maybe a story that you can that comes to your mind?
For me, it was probably a very long process, starting, I suppose, with being a pretty ferocious reader in childhood, going into my early and late teenage period. Some teachers at high school that really inspired me. Primarily, I had literary interests until maybe my early 20s, and I had this idea that I wanted to do something with literature. In secret, I was kind of nurturing the notion that maybe someday I could write something of some sort of literary value. So I had that kind of ambition, but to work with literature and contemporary literature was something that was certainly on my mind, and I wanted to study it. And that was the first thing I did study when I started at the University of Oslo back quite a long time ago. But then I suppose I had an interest in philosophy. I had my family. It was kind of the kind of family that would sit down and have these kind of wild discussions. And I also have friends both in high school and then as I started studying who were into philosophy, and I started reading more and more, and then I started studying philosophy. And I suppose I had some inspiring teachers, both in Oslo and then later in Germany, and then in the US, where I got my PhD. So I think it was a long process. I don't think I can point to one conversion moment when I thought philosophy is my thing. I took an interest in people like Sartre and Camus, the usual stuff early on, and then gradually moved on to Heidegger. Got a copy of Being and Time pretty early on, late in high school. But I had this idea that if I could crack this one open, then all my questions would be answered, and I could just walk away and be this whatever wise young person. And
right.
I remember sitting down on the beach in Oslo in the middle of summer, and I opened it and I started reading it. And
did you read it in translation?
Did quite work out that way?
Were you reading it in German?
English translation, and I didn't get very far after.
I don't blame you.
But I felt it had an atmosphere that kind of hooked me, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
made me think, this is worth pursuing. I shouldn't give up. It's worth going on with it. I felt somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Sartre and Camus because you're talking about this transition from literature to philosophy, and if you think about it, they're two prime examples of thinkers who kind of excel in both categories. Obviously, Camus' novels, philosophical value. I know sometimes they're perhaps underappreciated for their philosophy side, but still it bears witness in terms of the movement of existentialism. But obviously, Sartre kind of participating in and out of either ones, although some of his more philosophical works, like the Critique of Dialectical Reason or Being and Nothingness, perhaps aren't as literary as his other works, but still, it still bears merit. That's interesting that those two are the ones that stick out to your mind, or those who participated in the literary arts.
It really opened horizons for me starting to read this stuff, and also reading poetry. I started reading some of the classical modernist poets, like Eliot, for example, was
Mm-hmm.
very important for me at the time. But what I think I experienced was a kind of freedom. It was possible to think these kinds of radical thoughts and formulate them in a way that exceeded somehow the boundaries of what I had normally considered to be how one expressed oneself. To see that it was possible to think at this level meant it was a little bit like traveling for me, I think, very early on. Like growing up in Norway, we had the possibility of buying these Euro train tickets. So when I was like 17, I would travel during the summer, I would travel for a month around Europe with my friends and going to various amazing places in Europe. And these kinds of discoveries I also felt in philosophy and literature that would be really opening horizons. And there was a certain kind of freedom that was presented to me, a kind of a freedom of thinking, freedom of intellectual life, and the life of the mind, which just hooked me, I think, very powerful.
That's something that I have to be a little envious of, because when you talk about spending time at university in Germany, it's, for me, that sounds, someone growing up in the United States, that sounds like something exotic. But as you're saying, it was actually something part of your life. Traveling through Europe isn't so out of the ordinary. I think that's something to be a little envious of, I will say, and it puts a little perspective, this notion of whether it be voyaging or some sort of as a Deleuzian might say, a kind of nomadism. I'm a little envious of that.
Well, traveling in the US can be amazing too. But I was really fortunate to be able to travel in Europe at such an early age, and basically do it like on my own, with my friends, and just
Mm-hmm.
decide where to go and what to see and do was something that I really, in hindsight, think of as extremely valuable. And I hope young people can do this still.
Mm-hmm. What I enjoy about asking this kind of question, of sort of asking for a sort of narrativization as a segue into the conversation, is that it kind of puts in perspective, let's say, the opening chapter of your book, which focuses a lot about the role of narrative and the ways in which we experience and deal with and frame temporality. I thought that was an interesting, perhaps methodological opening to the work that helps to set up the rest of it. And specifically, I know that, Cooper and I, we talked a lot about chapter 2, but I think it just helps put in perspective the function of narrative, the function of putting in perspective that is essential to any sort of way of dealing with temporality, specifically in the mode that you're interested in modernity. But before we get into the work, the one that we both wanted to discuss with you, I would just ask if you can tell us a little bit about the genesis of your research or your interest in this, in your book on philosophy and temporality, from Kant to critical theory. Is this something that you've always been interested in? I know you've published recently on Heidegger and boredom, which is one framework within which temporality is expressed in modern philosophy. But I guess I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe tell a little bit of your interest going into this writing.
Yeah, I think I had kind of two interests in philosophy that prepared me for this. One was this kind of abiding interest in how philosophers, especially in the European tradition, have been thinking about modernity all the way, from the Kant Hegel material and all the way up to the great 20th century European thinkers who all sort of been reflecting on what it is to be, living in modern conditions. Its challenges, its differences from pre-modern arrangements and orders. Some of them obviously have had a pretty bleak assessment of modernity, as you
Right.
know, Heidegger and Adorno, for example. But I have been interested in these kinds of debates, the debates that Habermas once called the discourse of modernity, kind of an ongoing discussion about modernity. So that was one thing that prepared me for this, because it is this book on temporality that I published in 2011 is an attempt to, in part, think of temporality in conjunction with questions of modernity, as we'll get back to probably in a moment. And the other was really an interest in 19th century philosophy itself and trying to understand what the animating concerns have been. I mean, there's a library of works on the Kant, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche lineage. But I'm interested in finding new ways of looking at these classics. And it struck me that they all have a kind of opening for the question of temporality. And sometimes I would think most of the times when people encounter these thinkers, they think of their contributions to temporality in a relatively narrow sense. They think of it when they read Kant, they think of temporality as constitutive of the form of intuitions.
Right.
It's a matter of how we experience the world. It's temporalized. It's all very well. But I try to open this up a little bit and try to also think about other texts by Kant and also Hegel and other Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and so on, in terms of how they think about temporality in this kind of modern framework, in this discourse of modernity. So on the one hand, the whole discourse of modernity as such, and on the other, what's going on in this 19th century tradition. I mean, in hindsight, I'm kind of thinking, why did you have to make this detour through all of these 19th century philosophers? Why couldn't you just do what you did in the first two chapters, namely just analyze independently these questions of temporality and how they bear on questions of modernization? But I just found that what people like Hegel and Nietzsche and so on and so forth are saying about this is just so powerful and interesting and worth revisiting. So that's what kind of made me prepared for this specific book. But the time itself, temporality itself, was something that I would say I started to be attracted to questions about temporality around 2005, in part because I find these questions very intriguing and interesting, worth thinking about. Time itself is a complete chestnut, very, very hard to come to grips with philosophically, and philosophers have grappling with questions of temporality ever since antiquity. Very often, not just in terms of metaphysics, but in terms of questions of how should we live and what is a human life? How should we aspire to any kind of good life given various kinds of temporal conditions? So those are some of the things that kind of like prepared me for this book.
In a certain sense, you could have titled your book Philosophy and Modernity, but on the other hand, it seems like modernity is merely the, not to kind of pun, but the mode or modality within which temporality is kind of focused and highlighted, where really it's to a certain extent, modernity is kind of the inflection point for a lot of the thinkers that you bring into the dialogue. And you're right. I mean, you asked this question. You could have continued the mode of thinking that you highlight in chapter 2. But on the other hand, I think that it's important to bring in these thinkers into the conversation, and not to do so could also have the same kind of question that people might be begging to ask is, well, why did you leave out 200 years of contemplation on this subject? So I'll just say that in that sense, it's definitely important. And there was some, in terms of the thinkers, there's so many places we could start. So I'll leave that for a moment. But I will say one of the interesting things, because I mentioned your recent paper showing that you're still thinking about these things, but perhaps have been thinking about them for a long time, on Heidegger and boredom. When you discussed boredom, I thought it was really interesting because one of my professors at Emory was Elizabeth Goodstein, and you brought up her work because I know she's written at least one book on boredom. I don't know if she's written about it again, but she's obviously written on boredom in philosophy and literature and talked about Heidegger. And so seeing some of those themes come back was really interesting, and definitely, in terms of an effective modality of modernity, it was kind of interesting to see that focus, because sometimes we might think modernity is this hyper pace of trying to go fast and accelerate. But paradoxically, that perhaps when we can't seize the kairos at every moment, it's that in between time that can bring about the ennui and the boredom. I know that I'm kind of paraphrasing how your footnote details Heidegger's what is it, and what is called thinking, right? It's that anxiety that causes us to, I think that's how he puts it, right? It's our own unrestfulness and anxiety that causes man or something to infinitesimalize time and break it down into tenths and hundreds and thousands. So just thinking about the boredom that comes with the fast-paced life, and that they're not contradictory or mutually exclusive, that was definitely a big insight for me, or at least when I was reading one of them.
Yeah, just to note that you mentioned Liz Goodstein's work. I mean, she's a good friend of mine, and her work has been quite important for me when I was thinking about this book. I mean, she writes, as you know, and I'm very happy to know that she was your teacher. She wrote a book in which she analyzes the Austrian novelist Musil's Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, the man without quality, in terms of boredom as a kind of loss of meaning that for her has to do with a kind of incessant loss of frameworks of interpretation and value as the pace of modernization keeps increasing and accelerating. And she does this very powerfully, and I certainly got many ideas from reading that work. And I think it's worth, I mean, Musil's novel certainly, takes up many in literary form, obviously, but it's a kind of very philosophical novel. Takes up many of these more existential questions to do with temporalization that I try to deal with in the book, but that obviously Musil, manages in this extraordinary way to make vivid in the novel. It's really worth reading who are interested in these questions.
I'm glad you brought that up. I know that's something that Cooper and I have with past guests. It's been brought up, but hearing it brought up again as this refrain, something to read. We're always looking for recommendations especially for literature, because so many times we kind of focus on the philosophy side. It's important to remember the literary, and that was something that was refreshing about even though the philosophers are the main, so to speak, targets of conversation in the books, at least for the chapter headings, you don't shy away from various literary authors. Obviously Goethe comes up, Baudelaire, these other thinkers that are either sort of at modernity or sort of in the peak of its self-definition, or it sort of reflects upon what you said earlier about your sort of your interest in literature and how that kind of spurred you onto philosophy, and so you haven't. It's sometimes easy to focus on one or the other without bringing them into dialogue, and I thought that was that was good of you to remember that obviously they're contemporaneous and they share conceptual spaces to a certain degree, and I found that refreshing.
In this case, it's definitely worth looking at some of the literary works that, and there are plenty of them that do seem to, bring up various questions to do with temporality. You mentioned Baudelaire, in some of the poems of his, he's interested in this particular kind of urban experience of the moment that is forever irretrievable. Meeting someone or being exposed to someone in the crowd. This is a kind of an eminently kind of Baudelarian type of experience. Walter Benjamin also is interested in the crowd and these moments when you're realizing that this is someone you will never see again, or this moment is forever irretrievable. And it's as if modernity, or the kinds of social forms we have in modernity, sometimes deprives us of the possibility of holding on to things, because the speed of experiences and the speed of transactions tends to be very high. People who live in New York, the amount of people you are exposed to every single day on the street, it's worth pausing for a moment and think about the implications of it, and what it actually means to meet that many people that you will never ever meet again in a day.
I think it's good to juxtapose a kind of rationalization through philosophy and the discourse about temporality, specifically, certain thinkers that may or may not wax kind of nostalgic about the loss of whatever we might want to call meta narratives or something like this, versus how the mode of literature can capture that effective move without having to sort of reflect on it in this kind of discursive way. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I find Nietzsche to be another one of these thinkers who's able to weave the literary and the theoretical and sort of go in and go back out. And I know a thinker that you're highly interested in and written on, Adorno, with I see him at the peak of his Nietzschean moment in something like Minima Moralia, right? Where he's able to use those aphorisms to sort of walk the tightrope of literature and philosophy. And so I think that was something too that I appreciated in reading your work, was thinking about how philosophy is able to reflect on these things and probably make them explicit, but there's something more effectively intense in the literary modes of exposition. And that's not something we should forget, right? That we shouldn't always let philosophy have the last word, because that might give a false image of the movement of these things under consideration.
Sometimes you want to be on the inside of experience and not just talk about experience from the outside, as philosophers tend to do. And then I think the literary representation is definitely extraordinarily helpful in this regard.
Now, I know, Coop, we've got some notes here. We talked a little bit, you and I, together about chapter 2, specifically this question of obviously the rise of commodification. You talked to me a little bit about this. It almost seemed like this surprise or terror at the disembodied infinity of instance and all of this. I just wanted to give us a chance to dive into some of the notes and perhaps dialogue with Espen about that.
I'm not sure exactly where to start.
That's fine.
I did like this idea or this quote here, that time is an ahistorical dimension of a physical system, at least to provide some type of at least definition of what time, a certain type of time, may be interpreted as. Something that stuck out to me as well was this way that modernity creates a new form of contingency that I suppose would perhaps best be described as like an anxiety towards the future, because there's not this sort of, I guess, pre-modern cyclical form of time where things are more reassuring. There's a lot more stability in these sort of rhythms of life and nature, etc., and that exchange between the two and how that. So maybe talk a little bit about how you see contingency changing from kind of this pre-modern into the modern world.
So as you mentioned, I take a kind of pluralist approach to time. I don't think that we can reduce time to just this one category or type or dimension. I think there is definitely something like physical time that people in physics departments, or in the sciences in general, use and refer to all the time. And there are well-established theories like Einstein's relativity theory, for example, will give you an account of time, cosmological time. But I do distinguish that from, sometimes I think about that in terms of clock time. But when I talk about clock time, I mainly talk about the sociological fact that clocks and chronometers started to be used. At some point in history, in early modernity, they started to play a social role, helping people to organize their lives and coordinate action and structure their actions in various ways. And then I distinguish that kind of objective time from the more socially mediated and sometimes more subjective type of time that I think of as time consciousness or as lived time. This is a time that we relate to as acting and reflecting and living agents. That comes up for us as we start doing things, as we start relating to other people. And that tends to be structured in part through generalized conceptual relations and narratives, but also more personal narratives that kind of structure the way we experience time. And that's a form of time that explodes the present and points always both towards the future, anticipates the future, and also in various ways recollects and holds on to the past as it helps us to interpret ourselves and give us a sense of how we should go about responding to both other people and the world in general. Contingency is for me related to modernity insofar as modernity starts to weaken. I'm not an anti-modernist philosopher, but I do think that it is true, as Weber and Adorno and many other philosophers have pointed out, that there's a certain kind of weakening of the kind of value patterns that help us weave these narratives. One influence is, of course, clock time itself. Clock time itself is itself based on a succession of now points that are kind of neutralized in terms of value. Clock itself doesn't present anything that kind of gives us kind of interpretive pattern for us, but it helps us to structure time and structure our own actions in a kind of neutralized fashions. And that opens contingency because the past doesn't constitute the norms that allow us to understand ourselves in the way that it once did before modernity. Modernity is much more future-oriented than pre-modern social arrangements. We think about ourselves in terms of projects that, to a large extent, individualizes us in relation to existing patterns of interpretation and value. And that means contingency. Modernity is about contingency. Everything is possible in a certain sense. Nothing pre-given dictates in a certain kind of strong way what we should do, how we should interpret ourselves. And this gives rise to schools of philosophy like existentialism, for example, that kind of very strongly emphasizes the openness of human existence and the generalized contingency of human existence. You might call it freedom, a kind of freedom that we didn't really discover until modernity.
Well, what does it start? Says we're condemned to be free. That way of capturing the, as Coop brought up too, this anxiety that's nascent in the acceleration of technological progress, et cetera. I mean, and you said that obviously you're not anti-modern. You show this in your way of framing Simpson and the kind of neo-Aristotelian attempt to sort of reverse the futural-oriented aspect towards sort of recuperating some sort of I don't know, historical meta-narrative that values the past over and above. Because I at least appreciated your use of Habermas to kind of bring out this fact that if modernity, one of the things that it means is sort of kind of faithful to the Kantian lineage, I think, of what is enlightenment is not to let our sort of beliefs that we might cherish and value and give sort of authority to, not to leave those unquestioned. If we can't do it all at once, still there shouldn't be any sacred cows left or any like idols left unhammered, so to speak, right? And this kind of Nietzschean notion of the twilight of the idols and testing them out and making sure that we don't leave something standing or leave values unquestioned or untested that would have authority in themselves. I thought that was kind of an interesting way of doing it. But I guess I'll just say, and I'll throw it back to you, is you frame your concerns, but what I like is your relentless pursuit of nostalgia and hunting that out, right? Because the way forward is not to revert back inside or turn backwards and become nostalgic, because that itself has perhaps even more dangerous consequences that can, obviously we can see them in the rise of various fundamentalisms and nationalisms and whatnot. I mean, in the large scale, but it can also be disastrous for and paralyzing for individuals too. So I think that's part of the, let's just say, cautiousness perhaps that I see in your approach.
The introduction of clock time sometime in, let's say, the early 18th century, it started to be the dominant way of temporally interpreting oneself in a social setting, So in other words, people started carrying watches, they started consulting their watches, they started worrying about time and not having enough time.
Mm-hmm.
But they also were able to introduce a certain kind of quantitative and also calculative orientation thanks to clock time. You could plan and organize your actions and the future in a much more exact way than previously. Not just because your interactions with others could be more minute and precise, but also because the plans you lay can be organized precisely in terms of these quantitative steps. A commercial attitude to problems and life started emerging, with the rise of the bourgeoisie. And Max Weber, I think, was absolutely right in pinpointing the centrality of clock time in his study of Protestantism and what he called innenweltliche Askese, the kind of inner worldly ascesis, or ascetic attitude that he refers to when he starts thinking about this commercially oriented bourgeoisie that started emerging. And these are people who don't really consult how they should act in terms of tradition so much, but they're interested in breaking new paths and inventing new ways of acting that will tend to be more profitable in various ways. I mean, this is also the rise of capitalism. So I am saying in the book that this kind of gives rise to two anxieties. One is the one that we have touched on, at least Goodstein talks about, and that many other writers are talking about, that I think of in terms of a kind of loss of meaning, a loss of pre-given value patterns that simply don't play the same kind of role any longer as you get this new form of self-interpretation with the forward-looking, more quantitatively calculative orientation in modernity. And the second is an anxiety about transitoriness or transience that starts to emerge both in literary and in philosophical forms of interpretation and self-representation in modernity. The worry that this clock time is a time of nothingness in which present is just transitory, disconnected from the past and without any meaningful relation to the future, just passing by, as in the lines I was reading to begin with. That's also a kind of a massive type of anxiety that you see, for example, in Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And both of these kind of experiences of clock time dominating lived time and colonizing lived time give rise to anxieties that somehow have to be tackled. And you're right, neo-Aristotelianism is one way of trying to tackle this by simply saying, look, let's just step away from the temporality of the clock. Let's try and, for example, around the turn of the millennium, there was this kind of like movement of slow time,
right?
Eat slow, do things more slowly, stop referring to the clock all the time, stop being so busy all the time, cook more slowly, stop eating fast food, and pay attention to what you do. And ultimately, this referred to the idea that you could cultivate virtues in a kind of Aristotelian sense that would kind of allow you to step away from clock time and its incessant demands for acceleration and calculation. And I just express, although I have some sympathies with this, obviously, I also express some skepticism that society can just do this collectively. I think maybe you can find some sort of sanctuaries from clock time, but I think they're hard to sustain. I think they're hard to, I think it's hard to create allegiance to this kind of pre-modern experiences of time all across the board. So yeah, those are kind of my Adornian skepticism about these sanctuaries. And sometimes they can also provide false forms of reconciliation, I think, that we want to be cautious about.
So if we're thinking about modernity and economics and about, I think what the strategy is for modernity relative to investment is to try to get people to invest in the future as opposed to the now. And this goes to time preference, right? Because I'm exchanging immediate pleasure or leisure or whatever that is immediately for a future reward. In a logical sense, this should benefit society as a whole because people are foregoing their libidinal investments are not so structured on the now. So we provide a greater stability, a greater, I don't know, perhaps a construction of some sort of telos or something like that with regard to like a positivism, let's say, with regard to society. It's funny that sort of backfires, right? Because of I think the acceleratory nature that instead of taking these longer and longer views of society relative to libidinal investments, it's now we're on the quarterly, right? Where it's the reverse now. It's like the immediate quarterly return takes precedence over this longer term logic that I think that perhaps modern economics was kind of striving for, if that makes sense. From all of this, from a kind of sociological perspective, I don't know if that generates any comments or thoughts on your end, but this is something that kind of jumped out at me after reading the chapter.
Yeah, there's a German social theorist, Hartmut Rosa, who has written extensively on social acceleration. And I think he has been able to show quite compellingly that there has been since the onset of, processes of modernization in various dimensions in, let's say, the late 17th century, accelerations taking place. Life keeps accelerating. The speed of transactions, the speed of information processing, the speed of political and social change in general, it all keeps accelerating. Think of information, for example. It's pretty obvious that we keep processing more and more information. The speed of the processing of acceleration keeps accelerating all the time, incessantly. As many people have noticed, how are we supposed to be able to process or experience in the kind of the meaning of the German word Erfahrung. How are we going to really be able to process and take on board all of this? Walter Benjamin writes about how information undermines, for example, the possibility of genuine experience. He has in mind social experience in general, but also literary experience. What happens to narratives or storytelling is his big question in his essay on the storyteller, with the extraordinary kind of like impact of information. The Germans call this Erlebnis, and Erlebnis, are just these episodes of isolated informational impact on the mind. And as we all know, with phones and with the internet and so on and so forth, yes, we expose ourselves to tremendous amounts of information, but in the next moment, we have forgotten everything. It's just, do you really remember everything you scrolled and looked at yesterday? Probably not. But we keep moving forward. We keep accelerating. We keep throwing ourselves into the future, looking for more and more these episodes of experience, which isn't more than quasi-experience because disconnected from all existing patterns of interpretation that we can think of.
I think that
and this creates a certain kind of emptiness, a certain kind of nihilism, and a certain kind of loss of meaning. Modernity is radically futuristic or future-oriented, and I think that is true even more so today than 100 years ago.
Just in terms of commerce,
yeah.
Just in terms of commerce, I mean, I'm 40, and to just go, looking at the historical development of commerce, when I was born, you might call Sears catalog, place an order. Then we have late 90s, we have websites we can order from. Now we have our mobile phones, so we can buy now with the click. So even in that span, you can see like this tremendous compression of time express itself there.
Absolutely extraordinary. And obviously that does impact people's understanding of themselves and their understanding of what they can do with themselves in the world and how they should meaningfully relate to other people. It is going to impact on this, certainly. And I try to argue in this book that we perhaps need to cultivate a new way of being able to be attentive to new things rather than just having them pass by us in the ways that, for example, the internet is constantly imposing upon us a kind of norm of transitoriness, of having erlebnisse or experiences just passing by in an endless stream of consciousness without really being able to be attentive. But how should we cultivate this form of attentiveness? It's certainly not easy to think how we should do that given the media in which we experience the world today, especially, of course, the internet.
There's not enough time to collectively process any of the information at all. So it just picks up the speed, but there's no actual meaning behind it. That's
right. Yes.
I think the anxiety that modernity generates, I think about this a lot, is how it brings up or it intensifies the notion of wasting time, even relative to enjoyment, right? Because now, let's say you go on a vacation, you have your weekend, etc. You can now feel guilty that you haven't achieved whatever projects you wanted to get done over the weekend, or on your vacation, you didn't get to do everything that you set out to do. So there's almost this kind of weird relationship where it's an anxiety of like, as a being, I have this finite amount of time. I'm pressured to be wise in how I invest it. But even when I invest in something that is a waste, in quotations, that can still generate this guilt that I have this kind of productive pressure that is placed on me. And I don't know if that would be time that's pressuring us or what that force would be, but I don't know. I just think that's interesting relative to anxiety and contingency, because we don't know. It's this question of like, our contemporary moment. It's like, do I need to invest in my future or will climate change, devastate society, right? Like, what's that time scale look like?
Right.
How am I going to invest in my future? Am I going to buy real estate along the coast or in an area that has a very arid climate or is projected to have one, etc.? So these questions become a lot more pressing and dominate.
Just to piggyback, and I'll throw it back to Espen, this question of clock time, I kept thinking of the doomsday clock, which is supposed to be this representation, right, of humanity's or even life in general's viability. And there is this sense in which that is in the background too, looming more and more heavily in terms of, as you said yourself, Espen, if modernity is characterized by its futurality, with that hanging over us, impending, it does tinge that with a new kind of anxiety, right? Maybe it's actually the same anxiety just taken to a fever pitch, or it could be perhaps it's crossed the threshold where it's no longer about degrees, but it is actually different in kind. And if I had to qualify something as postmodern, perhaps that anxiety could qualify it other than a degree of acceleration. But I guess that would, sorry, Coop, I said I was going to piggyback and I kind of hijacked it. Anyway, Espen, I'll let you respond.
You're onto something important here. If you think of sort of classical modernity, late 18th century, 19th century, most of 20th century or first half of 20th century, this idea of the future as having a kind of priority both in people's private lives and also collectively, socially, I think seems to have been absolutely central. And time, thanks to the clock, could be commodified in ways that it couldn't before modernity and the prevalence of clock time. So we had this kind of like questions about time is something you invest in, but on the other hand, there's a goal down there somewhere that you want to obtain. So you want to move through this commodified time as soon as possible. But then on the other hand, it is commodified. So in a certain sense, you never have enough time, and you're worried that you will always need more time because time has a certain kind of commodified importance for you. I think some of these anxieties have receded somewhat. I mean, if we think collectively today, as you say, the awareness of possible kind of crises that seem pretty likely to occur in the 21st century, climate crisis in particular, but also people's thinking about the possibility of nuclear war and things like that. I think there's a certain kind of loss of collective futurity. Think of the great Marxist projects of the 20th century. They were extraordinarily emphatically oriented towards the future. Somewhere down the line, a new form of subjectivity and a classless society would emerge, and all our kind of structural deep problems would disappear. But it would be a future. It would be in the future, and people would have a utopian relationship to the future. Hope, in a certain kind of meaningful sense, that this would in fact occur if we just did the right things in the present. And I think nowadays we no longer have that. There's this massive loss of utopian consciousness collectively in Western societies these days. It's just so, I think, palpable. Now, I think individually, it may be less palpable, but I'm inclined to think that some of the things that the theorists of postmodernity said about this, for example, Jameson, that there's a certain kind of preoccupation with the now in late capitalist postmodern societies. I think that's pretty clear. It's more difficult for us to formulate structurally meaningful projects going into the future than it used to be. In part because of the acceleration that we just talked about. It's more difficult to predict how things are going to be down the line for us as individuals, but also the amount of information just makes it more difficult to make plans for us as individuals going into the future. And thirdly, perhaps something to do with commodification itself. and what it means to relate to the world through commodification, which in a sense frozen is a kind of frozen type of reality, and that doesn't quite let the individual make plans in the way it may have been possible in societies where people related less immediately through to commodities that were just given to you and presented to you as, you know, what one ought to do in the present. If you're in the shopping mall, you don't really make big plans for the future for yourself, but you are in a sense mesmerized by all the things that are presented to you in the present.
I like what you said about sort of the falling out of fashion of utopia, but it does seem perhaps it's almost like the flip side of nostalgic. To be utopian is to be almost like nostalgic in reverse or something like this. I don't know exactly the best way to formulate it, but it does feel like utopian now is almost, maybe it's always had that tinge as though it's fantastical or
the kingdom of heaven or whatever,
right
on earth, etc.
the kingdom of ends or something like this, where it seems far-fetched or it seems unpractical or something like this. So even the notion of practicality, even that purposive rational mode of view dominates over, something that obviously can't be done, in a moment's notice, but does take this, as you said, this sort of more long-term projective mindset. And given, well, I guess that's another affect we can think of, given just the dread of, or the impending quote unquote doom of the doomsday clock, that seems to, be the obstacle in the way of these longer term, futurally oriented, projected quasi-utopian or whatnot visions. So I know that we don't necessarily have to make this all about a bad vibe, but we should at least be realistic that that's one of the aspects of sort of, if we want to call this our modern condition, that's definitely an aspect that's hard not to think about. And I know that every few months there are new articles about how close we are to the precipice, or what we sort of need to do, and or whether we've already crossed the precipice. That type of uncertainty itself is also kind of difficult to digest, right? It's there are, and obviously there's many, and I can't really even blame them, people who would just say that's propaganda, right? Because it's much easier to function in life and to make plans. Obviously there's a certain arrogance in any plan making, right? Because providence can ruin those plans, but to continue living without, well, I guess metaphorically hiding your head in the sand and not dwelling on these things. That's how most people go about their daily lives, and I'm including myself in that, because to function, that sometimes too has to at least momentarily be repressed or just sort of ejected from consciousness. I didn't mean to ramble a little bit, but I just wanted to throw that out. And
no, I mean, I'm associating here, but I think Zizek sort of nailed some of this when he said, the kind of major demand of contemporary capitalism is enjoy. Here and now, just go out and get stuff and enjoy, which is very different, obviously, from the main imperative of classical modernity, which was repress, hold on, and don't enjoy yet. Enjoyment will be gratification down the line once you've deserved it, but you got to work first. You have to be purposive, rational, and then you will deserve it. Then you will be able to enjoy. But once you get what you want, then that's another just commodity that has to be invested. Something else has to be invested, so you constantly throw yourself into new projects. But nowadays, with a consumer-oriented capitalism, it's enjoyment. And you're right. I mean, we are largely forgetful of these things that may well be in store for us. Yes, we do read them in the newspaper. But I think in our actions, we don't pay attention much
Yeah.
to this. Otherwise, we would have changed radically what we do every day
Right.
in terms of consumption and the like.
If we might switch gears a little bit, I kind of wanted to. I have this notion of not the labor theory of value, but the time theory of value, because the way that you discuss time sort of becoming this form of nihilism, it reminded me of all time gets flattened out and is commodified such that there's a uniformity. It becomes then money is just a representation of this time, of this commodified time, right? It's an abstracted from that time. Because I think if you're speaking of a criticism of capitalism, I think that if you frame it relative to time, it's a much more powerful argument than, let's say, labor power, right? Because then you can start to think, okay, as a subject, I have a finite amount of time that I can invest. My time, for me, in my own internal market, my time is invaluable. You can't put a price on my life. Whenever one is negotiating one's labor recompense or what have you, you're never operating from an equal footing because you have scarce time, but society's demands do not, right? Society's demands are infinite. And so that's what markets are trying to calculate is ultimately time. And I think this would even go, Taylor, you would recall better. Some of this reminds me a little bit of our conversation with John Rofe about markets, right? And kind of the black swan events and trying to predict those events. That's just something that came to mind as well. I don't know if you recall anything that would be germane to this conversation.
So much of our conversation about that was whether or not black swans can be predictable. They obviously can be sort of explained in hindsight. Obviously, hindsight's 2020. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be able to reconstruct sort of that sort of argument in terms of the market. But I'll let Espen sort of respond to the bulk of your point then.
Well, if I understand you correctly, you're thinking about how markets.
Well, just in terms of labor, right? So at me as the laborer, what I'm really selling, I think, is in a way, I guess I'm selling my life force, but that force, I suppose, or that labor force is really comes down to time, right? I need to work X amount of hours to reproduce myself. That's at the bedrock, the calculation that's being made by the individual, and I think via the market. The market is trying to calculate, okay, times, and this also goes to investment as well, right? Because investments mature, you know what I mean? So the different scales of mortgages, right? You have a 30-year mortgage, blah blah blah. So all of this calculative, I don't know how to even put a pin on that per se, but so I just think that time is kind of the hidden thing, the sort of base that all of this is predicated on, but people don't really think about it in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right to point to Marx as a kind of pioneer when it comes to thinking about time and social time, because labor power is defined in terms of time, as you rightly point out from Marx. That's what the employer buys. He buys your time, he invests in your time, and calculates a certain outcome from the investment in your time. That's how exploitation becomes possible for Marx.
Yeah,
and of course, you as an employee also invest time, and certainly, yes, and labor has to be understood in terms of time and investment in time.
Going to college, going to trade school,
yes.
Taking classes, etc., investing in one's own productive capacity. But you're also making a wager, right, in terms of your time. So, and again, so all of the pressure, I guess, is transposed from the more collective forms of pre-modern civilization to this extremely individualized thing where all of the responsibility for determining your future is entirely on your shoulders, although you are still within the greater social that constrains your movement.
Yes.
As well, right?
Yes. So there is this formal temporal dimension to this, but I'm trying to argue in the book that formal determination, basically, clock time, objective time, is always in some kind of dialectical relation to lived time. Or you mentioned, for example, education. which is one of the examples I bring up in order to kind of illustrate the narrative form that lived time tends to take. That as you keep educating yourself, you may take seminars, you have a certain goal in mind, maybe you want to become a medical doctor. And there's a certain temporality to everything you do in college. There's a certain anticipatory dimension, and there's a certain kind of pre-given dimension having to do with how things have been done that you have to understand, that sets up a normative background or basis for what you do. And there are certain promises that you relate to in terms of what can and cannot be achieved given certain choices you make, and so on and so forth. All of this is sort of structured in terms of the overall narrative that you see yourself in as someone in pursuit of a particular kind of educational goal, going to college. And that creates a certain kind of meaning to what you do as you start disentangling the various dimensions of this kind of lived time. The narrative structure starts to make sense to you. But yes, underneath all of this, there's also a colder, calculative, more clock-oriented fact about what it is to get educated, in which you make a certain kind of investment that you want to pay off, and so on and so forth. And when you see young people today, well, I shouldn't say young people, but everyone, with their CVs, and you start asking, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Well, I'm building my CV. It's instrumental, it's calculative, and it's related to a certain way of dealing with temporality, which is disenchanted and ultimately, I would say, less meaningful than a form of temporality that can spring out from a more full-fledged kind of deep narrative understanding of what you do.
I was just thinking, back to this question of labor power, labor time, how something like fossil fuels, because what fossil fuels allow due to their energy density is basically compressed time, because really it's compressed work, right? It's like with regard to physics, right? Physical work. So you're compressing the amount of physical work that can be done, right? Because obviously burning a barrel of oil versus horses or humans pulling something, right? So that fuel is what allows for the acceleration of modernity to occur, because it's just a incredibly dense form of energy that compresses our ability to do work and allows us to develop in a way that even outstretches, I think, the ability of our human systems to comprehend or to develop a society or structure that can sort of navigate it, right? And I think maybe that's what the crisis of modernity is that we have outstripped our productive capacity so far that it's completely become detached from our ability to control it or grasp it, or it escapes us, right? We can no longer sort of comprehend. We can no longer really have a unified vision of a future. Everything is this sort of decentralized and fragmentary soup, I suppose.
I do think that we are, to some extent, victims of modernity's incessant acceleration and future-orientedness. We are paying the price now with the ecological crisis and with the climate crisis, and fossil fuels, of course, are that's the culprit, central culprit, but it's not just any culprit. It is exactly as you say, related to the achievement of speed and ever higher speeds and acceleration that modernists have been demanding ever since the invention of technologies based on fossil fuels. But we're paying the price now, and we're sort of on that train that Benjamin is talking about in this historical philosophical fragments. That train that keeps moving ever so quickly without any kind of emergency brake being available to us, it seems. We're trying desperately to find that emergency brake, but it's nowhere to be found.
I wonder if there's just a pressure to accelerate due to something to do with energy becoming less, hitting the upper threshold max of our energy, like our energy consumption. Because I think there's this sort of graph or gradient between, on one end, let's say you might have something like a concept of what what's the thermodynamic not ennui,
Entropy.
entropy, right? So I think acceleration is a way to mitigate entropy, right? So if you can keep speeding up and speeding up and speeding up, you sort of are in that position due to entropy, right? Because eventually entropy will catch up to you. You have to consume more and more energy to escape the accumulation of entropy. As you accelerate, then the returns on that investment in energy begin to diminish and you hit a crisis point. And then things sort of catabolize and fall apart.
I will say I love that you made the slip of the tongue saying ennui instead of entropy. So but that kind of encapsulates your point and hits all of these themes that we've kind of been discussing, especially given this notion of disenchantment that Weber talks about, that kind of we're talking about, in all these conversations, and just to sort of run with what you're saying, Coop. I mean, one of the things that I think about, with this talk about disenchantment is there's also all this talk about reenchantment that we've sort of seen recently. And the only thing that off the top of my head that I kind of think there's a false image of reenchantment of the world is, besides the things we've talked about, like a nostalgic return to some sort of conservative authoritarian past or whatnot, is the flourishing of new age aspects. Now, obviously, there could be here and there forms of holistic medicine or whatnot, meditation, etc., that can help certain individuals. But there's the tendency of new ageism to be itself this new trendy commodity, right? It is like it's the most saleable because it seems to claim to give us back this thing that we've inevitably lost. So I just wanted to bring that up. I know that that's not exactly what's being theorized by serious people talking about reenchantment in a way that avoids these things, but I feel like the main commodity of reenchantment is this new age form that I think is also pretty insidious and can take advantage of all of our sort of worst fears and insecurities that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I think you have in mind a certain kind of packaged, commodified form of experience, which is supposed to, present the world to you as though re-enchantment is possible. And like you, I'm pretty skeptical of that. But that said, I think there may well be aesthetic experiences in which there's a certain kind. I mean, if they're adequate, if they're successful, if there's a certain kind of attention to particularity and expressivity that can provide, if not re-enchantment, then at least a kind of connection to something that, on the one hand, is genuinely other than yourself, not just a reflection of yourself, and on the other hand, something which isn't just a category of something, but which has a real independent existence that you can relate to and perhaps find some meaning in relating to. I'm thinking, for example, of, artistic experiences like music, painting, literary experiences, in which there can be these kinds of openings towards a form of otherness that can provide meaning that doesn't really fall into the New Age category, but which, Adorno, for example, writes about these moments in Proust or even in Beckett that are moments of suddenness in which you break out of the kind of calculative, everyday, instrumental way of relating to reality. And it seems to me that it's worth thinking about these kinds of experiences. I think they are present in most people's lives in some ways.
Going back to this temporality and the kind of acceleratory mechanism, going back to our discussions of Lyotard's libidinal economics and not only the Taoist erotics part of it due to like investments, libidinal investments, but also like the cheesemonger, if you'll recall the story, right? And this goes to my kind of discussion of entropy versus return on
The
investment.
hyperinflation.
Exactly,
right?
because the cheesemonger has to so currency's inflating. The cheese has more value as a commodity, but he's constantly having to run back and forth with the cheese and acquire more money, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that was just something that popped in my head to put a stamp on that kind of notion that I had about time and entropy.
Yeah, the volatility is that aspect in the story. Yeah, it's the volatility of the money and the hyperinflation that
waste time.
There's this worry that the money he's selling the cheese for is not worth, won't be worth as much as he just got. Yeah, I think that's definitely hitting home in terms of, in another sense, the way in which we know, at least in the States, won't speak for globally, but we know that especially even since the pandemic, the rise in prices, we can call it inflation, but it's obviously has nothing to do with the amount that workers are being paid. And so that goes back to kind of what Coop's already speaking of. It's just we're moving from questions about energy sources to this question about labor, and so I'm kind of rambling here. And I will say, Espen, please feel free to respond to Coop. And once you do, I do want to give you the chance to talk about your current research, especially since you're on sabbatical, and perhaps what we can expect from you in the near future. But I'll throw it over to you.
I'm not sure I have any further things to contribute with,
Totally fine.
Regard to entropy. I wonder whether entropy really applies at this level, does it? I mean, it does apply in a kind of objective physical sense, but is it something that we can actually experience?
It's a good question.
If you read Thomas Pynchon, you will find, some interesting representations of people who, in a sense, are exposed to the consequences of entropy, right? A kind of steady movement towards chaos, and everything dissolves ultimately. And yeah, what am I working on now? I have had a project recently which bears some similarity to this one, in that I have been interested in modernity. I have been interested in the 19th century philosophers. That's been centering on religion. That's another kind of somewhat peripheral interest in the 19th century, but it's important in my view, nevertheless, both in Kant and Hegel. Hegel is definitely a very religious Christian thinker. Kant writes his philosophy of religion as a very old man. And then you get the generation of critics, starting with people like Feuerbach and then Marx and obviously Nietzsche. What I do in this book, which is going to come out with University of Chicago Press next year, I'm trying to look at these philosophers' interest in religion from the vantage point of both critique. They're all kind of criticizing a kind of philosophical understanding of religion, a kind of metaphysical understanding of religion. But they're also, and I think more interestingly, this is, on the one hand, there's this kind of Enlightenment criticism of religion, but on the other hand, they're all interested in what you can rescue from religion. They're all worried about secularization proceeding too quickly and thoughtlessly, leaving nihilism in its wake. And they want to see, is there anything that we can kind of rescue from religion without having to buy into the ontotheological premises of traditional rationalist philosophy. And in Kant, you find a kind of philosophy of hope related to religion. He criticizes ontotheology. He says we cannot have that. It's not possible to believe rationally in the claims of religion any longer, but we can still hope. And hope is kind of what can still be important for us. For him, it takes the form of morality, a kind of moral hope. Hegel is also very interesting in that he sort of makes everything temporal, absolute. He secularizes the claims to absoluteness, and sees modernity as secular in one sense, but also in another sense wedded to a certain claim to absoluteness that religion once claimed to possess. You get Feuerbach, and then you get Nietzsche, who's kind of perhaps the most interesting figure here. Nietzsche, postulates that God is dead, and we're living in the age of nihilism. Modernity is the age of the lack of orientation. But then again, he keeps going back to the possibility of some sort of retrieval of a pre-Christian, almost prehistorical way of understanding religion. The figure of Dionysus, is important for Nietzsche throughout, which is a figure of ecstasy, of transgression, and of a certain form of exposure to the holy and the sacred, which is extremely radically understood by Nietzsche. He wants nothing of Christianity. He wants an experience of transgression, which is completely different from all of that. And I'm interested in these moments of rescue and recuperation of the religious in this book. How is that compatible with modernity? I worry that Nietzsche perhaps completely calls on us to step outside of the framework of modernity. I wonder how that's possible. But at least those are the kind of interesting topics of that book, looking at the various ways in which this recuperation or rescue mission becomes thematized in these thinkers.
I just want to point out for the audience that you do discuss this a bit in one of the Nietzsche chapters relative to Dionysus and this notion of the god to come, which kind of reminded me of a little bit of Meillassoux talks about this as well in his work. I just wanted to flag that for the audience.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think it has to do with acceleration and the emergence of a kind of formal instrumental attitude towards reality. That the process of secularization can sometimes be very painful and sometimes be accelerated to the point of leaving people with just a big question mark. And I think some of these philosophers have kind of pointed to ways of rescuing some of what religion was offering people that can, in a sense, kind of slow down the process of secularization and make us land in kind of more soft ways, perhaps, than is otherwise the case. Some of the symptoms of insanity in modernity, for example, the rise of fascism, and nowadays are issues with political right-wing populism, for example, may have something to do with the speed of secularization, that people find these substitutes for religion that can be very dangerous politically. And maybe we should think more about how we can accept that secularization brings about a certain kind of nihilistic loss and think about ways to rescue moments of religiosity that don't have to commit ourselves to something regressive like fascism.
Right.
I think it can be denied that elements of Nietzschean thinking ended up in German fascism. I think that's true. But I also think there are elements of Nietzsche thinking that perhaps did not get called upon in that kind of massive regressive project that was fascism.
There is a selective reading of Nietzsche that can be weaponized in that way. And
yes.
But I do think it's interesting, right, what Coop brought up, mentioning to the audience and what you're discussing. I mean, obviously, as you said, there's a continuity between the book we discussed today and this one that is coming out, very soon. And I can see, as you mentioned, Dionysus Christ, that signing that he does towards the end of his life, call it madness or not, but there is this, that is an interesting yoking of the names and yeah, I mean, I just think about the process of transvaluation. It sounds like that's something that you're sort of discussing, and that sounds definitely like something that I would love to read about, because you're right, there is this sense, and this is kind of what I was getting at with the re-enchantment. There is the sense in which re-enchantment can perhaps go ways that aren't merely New Age commodification or a return to regressive authoritarian types of religion, that old time religion or whatever. There has to be modes that could be, whether we call it spirituality or what, there could be these modes that get rid of the pre-modern, or let's say pre-critical religion, right? There's got to be modes of it that can be salvaged, or as you said, rescued. So I find that very fascinating.
I think Nietzsche was thinking very, very deeply about this, and there's also the question of authority in Nietzsche. You know, who are we supposed to listen to, and how are we supposed to listen to them, and how is legitimacy and authoritative meaning created? And he certainly has a view that there are these exceptional individuals, these individuals capable of, as you say, transvaluation, radical reevaluations of the conditions of our lives that are supposed to lead us, in a sense. I still think that is somewhat, well, I think it's somewhat problematic in that it's very based on the idea that individuals can kind of do this through some sort of extraordinary act of will. I'm more interested in, let's say, modes of attentiveness and listening and receptivity. Maybe there's a certain kind of streak of Heideggerianism in me that I think that we have to also be able to pay attention to phenomena as they lend themselves to us and figure out how we can relate to them in a meaningful way. And we cannot do that just through these extraordinary acts of self-resolve that Nietzsche seems to cherish so much.
That's a great point. And I suppose, is there anything else you would like to share about any other research project or something you would like to do? Because I want to give you the last word before we sign off.
I'm currently writing an essay on the French Revolution and on Hegel's take on the French Revolution.
Right. Okay.
And again, I'm struck by how some of the same themes come up. Hegel sees, the French Revolution as kind of culminating with the Jacobin reign, and the Jacobins are these kind of radical modernists who want to break with the past, and the Thermidorian year zero is supposed to start. Where, yes, they had some Roman references and ideals, but they were supposed to be used for the sake of throwing oneself into the future in the most radical way possible. And Hegel thinks that necessarily leads to violence. That's where terrorism and fanaticism has its kind of origins. I'm very struck by that. And I'm also struck by how Hegel tries to think about the French Revolution in a more comprehensive manner. He wants to think, what can we do in Germany? How can we bring this kind of the legacy of the revolution to Germany? And when he thinks about that, he thinks about more than the Jacobins. He's interested in a more pervasive form of cultural revolution that would escape that kind of cold fanaticism and radicalism that he sees with the Jacobins. But it would take me a while to kind of tell you what I think about that. But I do see that some of the same themes come up for me. How can we be modern without falling into these traps of modernization?
That leaves food for thought to continue thinking about the conversation we had today. And I just want to thank you, Espen, for your generosity with your time. Not to, again, pun, I guess that's the theme, but you were very generous with your time. Thank you for your time, and thank you for agreeing to come and share your research and your scholarship with us. I really appreciate it. And
as do I.
We're both very glad to have gotten to spend time with you. And we're going to stay on after signing off just to talk about what we're going to be doing next week. So feel free to sign off whenever you feel fit to do so.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for a really interesting conversation. I'm going to follow your work for the future, and yes, I certainly enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, we'll be in touch next week when this episode will be live, and we'll let you know as soon as it hits the airwaves. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. And go and enjoy your Sunday evening. And thank you so much.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Once
Bye.
again, thanks to Espen Hammer for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.